And the people that we needed to do that were managers, people who could design and implement effective policy to manage the problems. And then the 21st century happened. And for me, the 21st century began in February 2006, when Jim Hansen gave this rather modest newspaper interview to the independent newspaper in Britain. And this is what he said, and it's important, I think, to read this and really understand the profundity of these remarks. He said, how far can it go? The last time the world was 3 degrees warmer than today, that's centigrade, so 6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what we expect later this century. That is business as usual or worse. Sea levels were 25 meters higher. That's 75 feet higher. That's what we know from the paleo record. The last time the world was that hot, that's how high sea levels were. So that's what we can look forward to if we don't act soon. How long have we got? We have to stabilize emissions of carbon dioxide within a decade, or temperature will warm by more than 1 degree, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to warm by more than that. That'll be warmer than it's been for 500,000 years, and many things could become unstoppable. We don't have much time left. Now, I'm not going to spend any time here talking about the necessity of stabilizing global warming pollution at 450 parts per million and then ramping down to 350. John Isham will be here tomorrow. We'll be running a conference on this up at Middlebury next weekend. Except to say that what Hansen did in 2006 was that he crystallized with this 10-year deadline a sense that had been building through the 90s and the early 2000s that that older frame of thinking about environmental issues was no longer tenable, that business as usual was no longer a possibility, that the choice that today's students face is working incredibly hard to stabilize global temperatures at 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, or else watching the planet slip into, with higher and higher probability, a runaway greenhouse scenario that's going to drive temperatures to 8 or 9 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of the century. And that would leave us in a world that Harvard economist Martin Weitzman has called with a terra incognita biosphere. So the choice is between a challenging and changed but recognizable world, or one that really will be transformed beyond and impoverished beyond recognition. So what that means is that management is no longer relevant. And instead, what we really need to produce is leaders. And leadership, you know, is a concept that has been out of fashion for 30 years. Ideologically, in this country, you know, we've been through an era of where government has been vilified and distrust of government is embodied in our culture. And yet, it's during times of crisis that people turn to leaders. And what we're going to have for the next 3 or 4 decades is sort of an ongoing crisis, if you will, one that demands a kind of leadership that we probably have never experienced before. We need a generation of leaders. So my remarks, I want to focus on an older leader, an academic leader, and that's Plato in the lower right-hand side there. So we're 380 BC, and he actually wrote a book on how to educate for leaders called The Republic. And he did it in a time of crisis. It was beyond Athens' golden age. Now, of course, he's one of the deadest of the dead white guys. And we have to take what he wrote in context and recognize he was writing in a slave society where his conception of leadership was very much an elitist perspective, and think about how to bring that into some sort of democratic context. But it's a very rich text, and I want to just discuss a couple of points from it. And the first is that the basis of leadership for Plato was an understanding of reality, that there is a there in the real world. And I think that's what environmental studies brings to the table. So, and this is important because in a postmodern world where political operatives feel free to try and spin press releases from prestigious scientific journals as left-wing political conspiracies, we do need to understand that there is a scientific basis and a material basis to that limits our politics and demands of us certain kinds of responses. For Plato, the vision of education was the allegory of the cave. And it's an important story. It's one that's worth retelling. So for Plato, people were sitting, Plato believed the mass of people viewed the world through a glass darkly. So the allegory is that they're sitting in a cave with their heads chained so they can only face one wall. Behind them is a giant bonfire, and between the bonfire and the people, there are servants walking back and forth with models of horses and soldiers and cities, so that what people see is actually shadows of images. So it's twice removed from reality. And the process of education is that turning around, that freeing yourself from the chains, that journey out of the cave into the sunlight where you're initially blinded and, you know, for some time it takes your eyes to adjust, but that eventually you do see the real world. And for me, there's no better example of that than this picture, which I've been staring at for 20 years and am only really now beginning to really understand what it means. It's a 400,000-year temperature record from the Vladivostok ice cores and Greenland ice cores. And what it reflects is that we are, in fact, in spite of what appears to be a very stable natural world, we are living in a world of climate instability, a system that's subject to very rapid swings in global temperature due to positive feedbacks in the system. That humans have been the beneficiary of the last 10,000 years of not only a remarkably warm period in climate history, but a remarkably stable period in climate history. And that finally we are leaving that. We have launched into what people call the Anthropocene. And the world will heat up well beyond the range of anything that human civilization has known in the next 50 to 100 years. And could, depending upon our actions, push us into sort of a truly catastrophic world. So there is that scientific reality. For Plato, though, as well, there was an ethical reality. The Republic is about a search for justice. And he was the ultimate interdisciplinarian. And in particular, Plato believed that a critical dimension of leadership education was in music and poetry. Because he felt that people properly educated to understand beauty would, in the outer world, would be able to understand rhythm and harmony in the soul, and that would guide against corruption because they could tell what was correct and just. Corruption in the soul and corruption in the state, which of course is the real challenge to effective leadership. So I want to read you two quotes to get our weekend started. And the first goes like this: like those who lead colts into noise and tumult to see if they're afraid, we must expose our young people to fears and pleasures, testing them more thoroughly than gold is tested by fire. If someone is hard to put under a spell, is apparently gracious in everything, is a good guardian of himself and the music and poetry he has learned, or she has learned for Plato as well, and if he also shows himself to be rhythmical and harmonious, then he is the best person for himself and for the city. So that's a comment for me on interdisciplinarity.